If you're anything like me, you probably enjoy a good TED Talk once in a while. It's great infotainment. It's something you can get something out of while spending some of your time being amused. We all like to do that. But it's kind of true as well, though, that TED Talks take on a pretty standardized template. There's a format that each of them follows. First, it's an introductory story to get your attention. And then I discovered a question. And after I've discovered the question, I'm going to tell you a self-deprecating anecdote about something that went wrong along the way of me trying to investigate this question. After I've told you the self-deprecating anecdote, I'll make a couple of false starts in order to build tension. You'll discover the different paths I went down, none of which panned out like they were supposed to. Then I'm going to give you 3 bullet points. That seriousness that I'm going to bring to those 3 bullet points will tell you everything that you need to know. Then I'm going to make an exciting breakthrough. Upon making my exciting breakthrough, then I'm going to give you a funny observation in order to push the emotional dial just a little bit. After I've pushed the emotional dial just a touch, I'm going to then tell you why I can't do this all on my own. And after I've told you that emotional issue about why I can't do it all by myself, I'm going to make an earnest plea for you to do something that will go out and change the world. And then I'll thank you very much. Now, thank you for coming to my TED Talk today. But the fact of the matter is that TED Talks do have a problem. It's that they're not particularly educational, highly entertaining, but not especially educational. And we need to figure out exactly why. Because if these are the kinds of things that audiences really enjoy, that people like to get into and like to spend their time with, that's useful information for those of us who are out educating adult learners for a variety of reasons. Now, the thing about TED Talks is that they are highly polished passion presentations. They're really good at what they do, but that passion is what makes them highly engaging. There's emotional heft to it. There's a selling point there about the person's emotional investment in the story, and their excitement is what brings people along. But it doesn't necessarily educate them. And that's the problem that we face. The thing about it is, when really well polished and really well practiced, a good TED Talk gets flow. And flow is an attractive thing. It's really good to have once you can get into the motion of it, but there are 2 problems that fall under flow. The first of it is that it's unnatural to be flow levels of enthusiastic about certain topics, particularly when you're talking about things like utilities and water and wastewater. It's really hard to get people into a flow about things like that. Pardon the pun, but there's just not a lot about it that has the emotional heft or the emotional drive that you'll find inside something like a TED Talk. The other problem is that flow itself isn't enough to ensure that learning is actually taking place. And we want learning to take place. That's the whole point of educating adult learners, particularly in a context of professional development or continuing education. We want people to take something away from what it is that we've delivered to them. That's tough to do, but there's a science to it. Now, here's the first step of the science part of all this. It's widely accepted that in order for people to learn anything and to take something with them, they have to be able to pause while they're learning to consolidate that short-term information that they've had into their long-term memory. If you don't give them a way to put that and deposit it in their long-term memory, it's likely going to be gone the minute the presentation is over. That doesn't really satisfy the need that adult learners typically have. They're there in order to learn something practical, something useful, something with application value. We want to be able to give that to them and deliver that to them. So we have to find a way to deliver that information in a way that's going to stick with them. So it's rare for anybody to learn anything permanent from something like a TED Talk because it tends to be a passive experience. You sit, you listen, you take what comes from it, and then it's all over. There's nothing to carry you away. Now, oftentimes there's that final point where you're asked to do something to save the world, but that tends to be just about it. We need to go beyond that if we want people to gain something useful out of their adult education experiences. The thing about it is, it's a low-stakes environment. Here's the problem. I thought that I could learn Irish Gaelic back when I was in high school. I thought I could learn it by listening to some tapes while I was going to sleep. Now, if anybody else has ever fallen into this trap, you might know what's resulted from all this. I know exactly one phrase in Irish Gaelic. Actually, it's just one thing that it describes. It's the word for whiskey, Uisce de Baha, and I learned it because that means water of life. Now, that story has stuck with me ever since, but not a single other word of Gaelic has stuck with me from all that time I spent passively listening, but not doing anything to process and not doing anything to consolidate that information into my long-term memory. That didn't pay off for me, and it's not going to pay off for any audience if they're just merely passive the entire time they're taking information in. Even if they're engaged in something like a TED Talk, we have to give them something to latch onto that they can put permanently into their memory so that they can make use of it going into the future. Adult education takes strategy. It takes a defined plan in order to get the information that you want into those minds of those adults. It's really important to take that step, but if you do, the payoff can be rather substantial. Given the wide-ranging and accelerating effects of economic change and technological change all throughout our world, the need is greater than ever for adults to learn and for adults to become better at what they do. We also then need to match that with better adult education. So I embarked on a master's degree in education. My background is in economics and communications. My experience as a person in this workforce is nearly 20 years as a sales engineer. None of that is educational, or so I thought. But when I really drilled down to it, I realized that most of my time is spent either training or explaining. So if I'm spending all that time doing those things, I realized that I needed to spend some time investing in my ability to actually educate others, not just to talk at them, not just to entertain them, not just to throw facts and figures that ought to be compelling at them, but to actually give them something useful that they can carry away and make use of going into the future. I wasn't sure whether I was just spinning my wheels before. I knew I could keep an audience, and I knew I wanted to give presentations. I knew that conference organizers liked to bring me in because they said, people like your presentations. But it didn't mean that anybody was actually learning anything. And it turns out that I'm not alone in wondering about this. It turns out that all my research to do this master's degree turned up that basically there is next to no solid academic evidence that's been built up or retrieved or collected or studied at all as it pertains to low-stakes adult education. And that is a crime because the direct and indirect costs to this are just enormous. Now, our really big problem here is that most adult education takes place in what we'll call, and what I have called, a low-stakes learning environment. And Americans aren't trained in low-stakes learning. We're just not practiced in it. We're just not good at it. We are trained by our K through 12 experiences and even our collegiate experiences to be practiced in studying for the test. The fact of the matter is that once you establish any kind of system that has any kind of rigor, any kind of training that goes on that has any kind of checks after the fact, then you've essentially taught people to study for the test. Now, it's pretty much invariable. Learning for the test is basically a standard feature of anything once we've done any kind of systemic reform to the system to make it rigorous, to make it practical, to make it replicable. And once you establish a standard, whether it's No Child Left Behind or a PE exam or a professional operator's exam, anytime you've established a standard and created something like a test, you've created an objective standard that then people are going to study towards and people are going to train towards. It's just invariable. It's not good or bad. It's just simply unavoidable. But it's not how most of the learning for those experiences tends to take place. It's like the rising and the setting of the sun. We have to acknowledge that it exists. That doesn't mean that that's how we have to adapt to it. We can respond in ways that can be really productive. Learning for a test is its own skill set. Now, I know this from personal experience. When I was in high school, I took calculus. I took AP calculus. And when you take an AP course, you take it so that you can study and pass the AP exam. Passing the AP exam can mean that you can skip out of hours and hours of your college experience by testing for that credit. I did that experience, but as I was going through my high school calculus course, my teacher told everybody all the time, everybody who takes my class gets a 5 on the exam. The 5 is the highest score. Everybody who takes my class gets a 5. Everyone does it. He was assuring everybody that that was the way it was going to be. After watching me go through an entire year of struggling to get everything to work just right in calculus, my big problem, I always wanted to go the hard way around the block instead of the easy way. Well, that's not the way to do calculus. But anyway, after all of this, and after watching me do all of this, my teacher pulled me aside at one point after having spent the entire year telling everybody in my class gets a 5. He goes, "Brian, a 3 is a very respectable score." He actually said it. I try not to get an even better score than that, but that's not the point here. The point of this is that in every environment that we have, in every learning environment that we have, really until we are adults and then beyond, we get trained to study for the test. We get trained to practice for the test, not necessarily to retain the information so that we can actually put it to use outside in our lives. So trainers and educators need to look at teaching adults as a way that they need to focus on optimizing the chances for learning for people who don't have that skill set. I was a really good test taker, so I could pull off a better score on that exam than I really deserved. I should have gotten a much lower score on the AP exam for calculus because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't learn from it. I was able to play the game of winning at the test. Now, there are a lot of people who are like that. There are people who are just good, natural test takers. But there are a lot of people who aren't. And the thing is, we don't want to double up on the difficulty for those people. For those people who can learn but may not perform well on the test, if they don't have that skill available to them, we don't need to make their lives harder by only teaching so that they can only succeed when it comes to an objective exam. So we also need to make sure that continuing education in general also actually leads to learning. If we see that there is some direct benefit to us as learners, we tend to have a little bit more attention. We tend to dial in, we tune in, we pay better attention and stick with things. But the fact of the matter is people don't stick with things indefinitely. Intrinsic motivation can be enough to motivate learners, keep their attention high, if the subject that they're trying to study has a clear if A, then B kind of payoff. If I watch this YouTube video, then I will know how to solve the problem that's immediately in front of me. But that's not really enough, and it's unlikely that any training subject in the water and wastewater universe, or by and large in a lot of other places in adult life, are going to be the kinds of things that are going to hook you like you're watching a TED Talk. So we're not providing that intrinsic motivation, and we aren't necessarily providing that flow that people need to get where they're going. So this isn't a problem with a technological solution. I wish it were. It would be great if you could plug in like you're Neo in the Matrix and learn Kung Fu overnight. But you can't do it. Nobody can. We have to process and activate the information that we get in order to make it a part of memory that then we can put into use out in the real practical world. So what's the alternative to downloading it like you're Neo? Well, unable to find a better name, in my research, I found that nobody had really given this stuff a name, so I gave it one. I called it punctuated stimulation. The fact of the matter is that you have to come in and poke your audience again and again and again and stimulate them while you're giving them the information that they need. And there are a couple of techniques that you can use to do this. In fact, there are 3 techniques that we've found that are anywhere in the literature about sustaining adults' attention while giving the brain some relief so they can consolidate that information. And remember, it's a 2-part issue here. We need to keep them interested and keep their attention high, but we also need to give their brains a break so that they can process what we've just told them and move it from short-term into long-term memory. Broadly speaking, most people seem to think that we have a short-term memory that we can call upon. That's maybe in the range of 5 to 10 minutes worth. After that point, if we don't put it into long-term memory and keep it there, then we're going to lose the information that we were just told. This can work sometimes if we're studying toward a test, if we know what the test questions are going to be. That's why people who are able to study and able to play well the tests can succeed at this. But by and large, when we're teaching adults, we need to give them that opportunity to process the information, not in a test-taking universe, but in a practical, useful world, so that they can make it work for them. So these 3 techniques. 1 is humor. 2 is what we call seductive details, and 3 is what we call solicited audience feedback. These are our 3 ways of capturing people's attention and giving them a chance to process what they've learned. First of all, humor, of course, is pretty easily recognized. It's widely used in presentations. People are told, make the audience laugh. If you feel uncomfortable, go up there and imagine them all naked, or at least in their underwear. That is a device that can work for some folks. But the problem with humor is this: to have any chance of success, even though this is the go-to tool everybody thinks they need to go to keep audiences engaged with them, humor has to be both relevant and appropriate. Now, appropriate can be a real task, particularly when you're talking to an audience that deals with things like wastewater. When people make jokes like we're number 1 in the number 2 business, it's pretty hard to be appropriate at all times. But that's the universe that you're working with. If you can get over that hurdle, The other part is that that information, that joke, has to be somehow relevant to what it is that you're teaching them. And relevant has a lot of work to do here. It's pretty hard to find a relative joke for everything that you're sharing with people. So it doesn't always have to be a joke. Sometimes it can be an amusing anecdote. It can be a detour. It can be a side story. But the point here is it has to be tied into what you're talking about. It has to be relevant so that it doesn't disrupt that flow that's keeping the audience interested and engaged. The payoff has to be something that lightens the cognitive load. The cognitive load being how much your brain has to do to think through what you're talking about and to process the information that it's being given. Cognitive loading is a huge issue. If you throw a bunch of facts and figures at people and expect them to memorize them on the fly, you're giving them a huge cognitive load to deal with. You're also giving them a huge cognitive load to deal with if you just shoot people a huge pile of text on a screen, like those PowerPoint slides that everyone has seen that contain War and Peace in terms of words, or 48 bullet points all on one screen. If you're trying to read that while also trying to listen to the person who's trying to teach you something, the cognitive load is through the roof and you won't succeed at all. You'll memorize or remember very little of it at all. The whole point here is that humor is trying to lighten the cognitive load so that we have a moment to consolidate the information that we've just retrieved. It has to be just long enough for that memory in order to stick. Now, of course, there's also the hang-up that no two people find all of the same things funny. It's really hard to satisfy an audience, especially once you've reached 25 or 50 people. If they didn't come to hear you do your stand-up comic routine, it's really hard to deliver humor that will lighten that cognitive load, give people the break to think through what they need to consolidate, and be something that's relevant enough that you don't disrupt the flow of the whole presentation and the whole conference talk. There's no good to that. When I joked about the TED Talk template, for instance, or poked fun at how I passed my AP exam, did you laugh? Did you find it funny? Did you have some kind of setup that worked for you? Did I set it up right for you to appropriately appreciate it and enjoy it? Were you in the mood even to be amused? I don't mean to scare you away from the use of humor. Humor can be very helpful. It can also be a great way to relieve stress, particularly if you're the presenter. But the fact of the matter is that if comedy were easy, then great headlining stand-up comics wouldn't have warm-up acts. They don't walk into an audience cold. They have somebody warm you up first. Then you're in the mood to laugh. It's hard to do that when you're trying to educate adults. It can work, but it's a dangerous gamble. It doesn't always pay off. So this takes us to seductive details. This is an aside that's interesting enough to draw us in, but that we as the instructors or presenters identify as being irrelevant to what the audience needs to actually take away. So the jury is very much out on seductive details. It really is. By definition, they sort of derail the flow. They depend on a high level of trust between the presenter and the audience, the learners, that the learners can say, okay, when the instructor says this will not be on the test, I can believe that it won't actually be on the test. It requires a pretty high level of belief and of trust. If you don't have that already established, then it may or may not work to bring these things at all. Paradoxically, if people don't have that level of trust with you and they think, well, maybe they're saying it's not going to be on the test, but I've been tricked before, then you may actually be increasing the cognitive load all over again, which has a huge set of consequences. That's costly in mental terms. In a textbook, the well-intended pull-out story like that is intended to be a visual example of the seductive detail. It's saying, here's something that's not part of the main text. You might find it interesting. We hope it keeps you engaged. Now, maybe I'm just a cranky old man by nature. It's possible. I admit this and I confess this possibility. But those things drove me nuts. They drove me completely bonkers. If you were like me in school, and let's think about it, were you? Then I felt like I had to read them, and I felt like I had to remember what the information was anyway, even if I was told it was completely irrelevant. Even if I was told, no, we're only telling you for this amusement's sake. I still had to evaluate the information and then decide whether it was worth putting in my permanent memory. That increases the cognitive load. That doesn't make my life easier, it makes it harder. I feared that information might end up on the test someday. So you have to think, did that happen to you too? If it did, then a seductive detail might be costlier than it's actually worth. It might impose more of a cost on your brain than it's going to pay off to have in keeping people attentive. We want our audiences to be attentive. We want them to be engaged. We want them to be enthusiastic. We don't want to overwhelm them with things that they aren't going to use. So while seductive details are an identified strategy widely recognized in the literature, there's really very little substantial evidence that says these are the way to go. There's evidence out there that they might work, but there's a lot of contravening evidence that suggests that they won't. And there's almost no rigorous research on this that really tells us how it works out in that low-stakes learning environment, where again, the audience isn't being tested at the time that the information is being given to them, or immediately they're following. So you're always going to feel like a hero if you tell people, you aren't going to be graded on this. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily keeping people in the flow where they're going to absorb and process the information that you're trying to give to them. And this brings us to punctuated stimulation technique number 3, solicited audience feedback. Now, the only real limitation on solicited audience feedback is the technology that you have available to you. If you're in a room with real live people, then hopefully you already have the experience that tells you to look around the room and try and gauge whether people are still with you. Are heads nodding as you say things, or are heads falling onto the desks in front of them? And in a live environment, you may even be able to go as far as the fully analog route of simply asking people, give me a show of hands. Do it every 5 to 10 minutes. Give people that opportunity to briefly consider whether they've learned something and put it into their long-term memory as you bring it up. Asking for that show of hands on a subject signals to people and tells them that it's important. And you might want to do that just to make sure that people are still with you. Those are very good practices, and you should use them without reservation. But technology actually does give us a way that we can make this go even farther and even more effectively. If you have the chance with the right technology and the right willing audience, those are two things it's important to have at the same time. My research and my review of all the literature that's out there, and I think it was pretty exhaustive, basically substantiates that getting live feedback from the audience, getting their in real-time response to, are you with me? Did you get what I just said? That basically is unequivocally the best way to go for keeping adult learners paying attention. I didn't have the luxury of getting live feedback from the audience because while I was doing my research on this subject, we had a pandemic going on, so we couldn't get a live audience together to test this kind of thing out. But you should have caught on to these several occasions as I've been talking to you today when I've asked you to ponder a question to see, are you with me? I can't see you, I can't see a show of hands, but I can ask you to at least pause and consider it. If we're able to ask those questions occasionally and keep people engaged, that may very well give them the best opportunity, the best shot we have at keeping them attentive and giving them that chance to put that information in their long-term memory where it'll work for them. I did this by asking some introspective questions, right? I asked you to consider, for instance, whether you recall paragraphs from your school textbooks. Here's what's exciting about solicited audience feedback. There are technologies available right now off the shelf that will permit you to ask the audience in real time, are you with me? And to get a real-time feedback monitor that tells you, hey, I've lost them, or everybody's on board, let's keep charging ahead with where we're at. They let you ask this critical question of, are you with me, but ask it with the veil of anonymity. These are great technologies to have available to us now as we're trying to teach adults. Now, whether you use these tools for soliciting audience feedback in order to offer little pain-free Quizlets along the way, or to ask about the audience's prior knowledge, or just to take their temperature on, have I convinced you so far of where we're going? What can you do with these live feedback tools? A lot. You can do polling, you can ask for quizzes, you can look for just a basic true-false, are you with me? Are we doing what we should be doing? That live, real-time feedback is enormously valuable. Now, what I could find from the very limited, again, extremely limited academic research literature on this is that these substantially increase not just people's comprehension of what you taught them, but also their satisfaction with what they've been learning. People like to be able to say, nope, I'm not getting it, but they want to be able to do it in a way that isn't embarrassing. And if you can do it through these free online tools that permit you to get audience feedback in a completely anonymous format, life turns really good. Now, intuitively, this ought to be pretty satisfactory to you. If you can stop to think about whether you are learning something as you're being taught the subject, then that's clearly helping you to take a step to consolidate the knowledge that you've just been given. I was only able to conduct really one solid case study on this, but when I did, I found that with a completely novice learner learning about a relatively sophisticated engineering topic in hydraulic modeling, that I was able, just by using those simple basic questions along the way, stopping and pausing every 5 to 10 minutes to ask questions along the way, I was able to find that that student really substantially improved their enthusiasm for what they were learning and what they were able to take away from it. They self-scored much higher using that technique for punctuated stimulation than by any other, or as well by using no techniques at all. So ask yourself this: do you feel respected when someone asks your opinion of their work? Because isn't that what an instructor is essentially doing when they say, "Are you with me? Did you get what I just told you?" They're actually asking you to assess them rather than vice versa. That's helpful, and people are capable of doing that relatively enthusiastically. We've all been in bad lectures before, and who wouldn't have wanted to pull the plug on a bad lecture if given the opportunity? If you're not getting it, if you're not getting what you're being told, it's useful for the instructor to know that so they can stop, back up, and try again. In the end, it comes down to this. If you're comfortable with it and you're capable of threading the needle with being both relevant and appropriate at the same time while still getting people to laugh, go ahead and use humor. It is at least something that'll keep your audience alert. That's a great choice. Unless more compelling evidence comes along, I would recommend steering clear of seductive details, anything that drags people away from the main thrust of what you're talking about and imposes more loading on them to decide whether what you're telling them is important. Even if you tell them it's not, which is what you're supposed to do with a seductive detail, they may not believe you, and it just doesn't seem to be worth it. And in my own case study, not only did the seductive details perform worse than the other two techniques across the board, they also performed worse than no technique at all. So you don't want to drag yourself down by using a technique that isn't going to work. But however you can do it, from a show of hands all the way through live polling tools, pause frequently. Try again every 10 minutes or even more often to ask people to consider and self-assess. Are you still with me? And am I doing a good job of explaining what it is that I've just walked you through? Preferably using one of these tools that permits the audience to remain anonymous when responding so that they can avoid, again, any social stigma or embarrassment. Since you're not pouring anything new necessarily into their heads when you're asking them this question, it lightens their cognitive load while it also gives them an opportunity to process what it is that you've just told them and assess for themselves. And it turns out we're pretty good at self-assessing whether we actually understand a subject. It helps them consolidate that short-term memory, and it then makes your overall presentation, your overall lecture, your overall instruction more effective for the audience that, again, is invested in being there. They want to learn. Adults want to learn. We just have to make sure that we approach it in such a way that actually helps them get to that destination. Thank you very much for coming to my very much not a TED Talk.